Hey there fellow classmates. This is our video about cell transportation. This video shows the different kinds of transportation. We will sum up what happens during these different types of transport processes. Thank you for watching our
Simple diffusion. Small, nonpolar molecules can pass directly through the lipid bilayer. This type of movement is called simple diffusion. Oxygen diffuses into the cell through the lipid bilayer. The concentration of oxygen is higher outside the cell than it is inside. Thus, oxygen moves down its concentration gradient into the cell. In contrast, the concentration of carbon dioxide is often higher inside the cell than it is outside, so carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cell. Natural steroid hormones, which are nonpolar and fat soluble, can also diffuse across the lipid bilayer. Facilitated diffusion. Many ions and polar molecules that are important for cell function do not diffuse easily through the nonpolar lipid bilayer. During facilitated diffusion, transport proteins help these substances diffuse through the cell membrane. Two types of transport proteins are channel proteins and carrier proteins. Channel proteins. Ions, sugars, and amino acids can diffuse through the cell membrane through channel proteins. These proteins, sometimes called pores, serve as tunnels through the lipid bilayer. Each channel allows the diffusion of specific substances that have the right size and charge. For example, only sodium ions can pass through the sodium ion channel. Carrier protein. Carrier proteins transport substances that fit within their binding site. A carrier protein binds to a specific substance on one side of the cell's membrane. This binding causes the protein to change shape. As the protein shape and changes, the substance is moved across the membrane and is released on the other side. In the picture, the first on the one on the left, the molecule outside the cell binds to a carrier protein on the cell membrane. On the second picture on the right, the carrier protein changes shape, which releases the molecule inside the cell.
Active transport. Sometimes cells must transport substances against their concentration gradients. This movement is called active transport because the cell must use energy to move these substances. Active transport requires energy to move substances against their concentration gradients. Most often, the energy needed for active transport is supplied directly or indirectly by ATP. Pumps. Many active transport processes use carrier proteins to move substances. In facilitated diffusion, the carrier proteins do not require energy. In active transport, the carrier proteins do require energy to pump substances against their concentration gradients. One of the most important carrier proteins in animal cells is the sodium-potassium pump. Sodium ions inside the cell bind to the carrier protein. A phosphate group from ATP transfers energy to the protein. The protein changes shape and releases the sodium ions outside the cell membrane. Outside the cell, potassium ions bind to the pump. As a result, the phosphate group is released from the pump. The pump returns to its original shape and releases the potassium ions inside the cell membrane. For every 3 sodium ions taken out, 2 potassium ions are brought inside.